Hello, and welcome back to the Fireside Lit Book Club, a quiet, candlelit corner of the internet where we read slowly, think deeply, and speak authentically about our experiences. I'm Lindsay, and I invite you to join me by the fire as we explore the soul of a book, the beauty it reveals, the questions it asks, and the ways it helps us understand life, identity, and meaning just a little more clearly. I hope everyone is doing well. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere, hopefully that you're enjoying some warmer spring weather. And with the change of seasons has brought a new selection of books for me, including a few which weren't on my original TBR for this spring, but I ended up making some changes, as I often do, and picked up The Awakening by Kate Chopin. This is one of those books that I really didn't have any expectations for going in. I knew very little about it, but it ended up being a really, really fantastic and weighted read. I think for me, I tend to get a lot out of books that explore deeply human themes, such as love and sacrifice, fate versus free will, good versus evil, and equality versus oppression. And The Awakening primarily explores the first and the last of these, and was published in 1899, overlapping with the women's suffrage movement in the United States. Chopin herself was an early feminist, which translates very clearly in her work. In fact, after the death of her husband, she lived by her pen to support her family of 6 children. She wrote over 100 short stories and essays for publications like Vogue and The Atlantic, and originally received much backlash over her unconventional stances before eventually becoming a foundational feminist author in American literature. What I particularly loved about The Awakening is Chopin's very honest portrayal of her heroine's feelings and struggles as a housewife and a mother. As we know, marriages at that time, especially among the upper crust of society, often had very little to do with love and were more typically arranged based off of mutual benefit to both parties. As a result, the main character, Edna Pontellier, never truly loved her husband and already has 2 young children by the age of 29, before ever learning much about herself, developing her own skills, or pursuing her own interests. We get the impression very early on in the novella that Edna often feels isolated and lonely. We see that her husband is more or less a lug, to be honest, making empty promises to the family before skipping town on miscellaneous business ventures and exercising control over his wife the way so many men did during that time. And as a result, Edna doesn't feel that she has a partner to share her feelings with. It's clear that she feels misunderstood, neglected, and strictly ornamental. As proof of this, we arrive at a scene in the first few chapters where Edna's husband awakens her after coming in from gambling late at night, scolds her for essentially not being a good enough mother by his standards when he himself is never present for their children, and then promptly falls asleep, leaving Edna wide awake to grapple with her many feelings. This is clearly not a great marriage, and we see throughout the book that though Edna is provided for, she's not truly cared for. And her heart longs for this, understandably. It is perhaps because of the poor treatment she experiences from her husband that Edna begins to develop feelings for a young man, Robert Lebrun, who is a few years her junior and has a reputation for attaching himself to a new married woman every summer when families come to Grand Isle on vacation. So he's a bit of a rover. He has a bit of a reputation. And what starts out as a friendship eventually becomes more amorous, and this is the catalyst that leads to Edna's awakening. She doesn't even have an affair, like a blatant affair with this guy, yet Robert's and her shared feelings lead her to realize she has lived too much of her life doing what others have expected of her. When Edna and her family return home, she begins snubbing many of her household callers, whom she has never really had an interest in seeing in the first place. She neglects the duties of the household to spend more time on her artwork. She declines attending her sister's wedding despite familial pressure, and even goes so far as to move into what she calls the pigeon house, a small, cozy cottage where Edna is able to live life on her own terms for the first time ever. This development and progression is the whole point of The Awakening. Chopin develops a character whom many women could relate to at the time and many still relate to today. Edna's thoughts and feelings about her marriage and about her role as mother are not sugar-coated, which makes the story and her character feel real and three-dimensional. For instance, on page 22 of the Penguin Classics edition, we get quite a shocking admission. She was fond of her children in an uneven, impulsive way. She would sometimes gather them passionately to her heart. She would sometimes forget them. Their absence was a sort of relief, though she did not admit this even to herself. It seemed to free her of a responsibility which she had blindly assumed and for which fate had not fitted her. This passage reminds me of a meme I saw on social media that goes, I've never loved someone so much and also been so excited for 7:30 p.m. And I actually laughed when I saw it for the first time because it was so relatable. And I suspect this duality is the case with most mothers. And that doesn't make us bad mothers. It just makes us human. I think, especially with women, there is this expectation that our lives should revolve endlessly around our kids to the point where we never say anything bad or too honest about motherhood, which is honestly just crap because much of parenting is exhausting and draining and just really, really hard. In that same breath, there is nothing else quite like parental love in this world, but it is foolish and narrow-sighted to assume that a person's sole purpose and joy in life should automatically be their role as a parent. And because this assumption primarily gets placed on mothers more so than fathers, a lot of moms feel inadequate or ashamed for the very normal experiences of burnout, overwhelm, or sensory overload. This is where I have decided I'll get into a little commentary on feminism as a whole and on gender constructs, or at least my take on them. And this is an area I've always had a lot of thoughts and opinions on, and my husband will actually tell you when we first started dating and we used to have these long conversations dissecting social issues, I would often reference the US sexual revolution as one of the biggest contributors of harm to both the family unit and to women as a whole. And my theory behind this, or my philosophy, I should say, is that one extreme begets another. So on one hand, you had a society that severely restricted and oppressed women. In this country specifically, women couldn't even hold a credit card in their name without a male cosigner until 1974. Marital rape was not recognized or made illegal in all 50 US states until 1993, and women could be fired without legal protection if they were pregnant up until 1978. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So as we can see, women were consistently treated as less than, as property, by all accounts, for much of human history. They were subjugated by men who never really viewed them as equals or partners, but rather as property. And the system was extremely unjust to women. So, of course, the response to that is going to be huge because, again, extremes lead to more extremes. Women went from being kept in the home without their own money, opportunities, or personal freedoms to burning bras and neglecting their families to pursue endeavors outside the home, despite how that might have affected their loved ones. And of course, someone pays the price. Someone always pays the price. For hundreds of years, it was women who were quietly suffering, and now we have broken homes and suffering families because many women decided they should no longer be required to make any sacrifices. And this obviously goes for husbands too. Sacrifice is necessary on both ends for a stable, loving home, and I think both parties should be held to the same standard for the care of the home and the upbringing of the children, perhaps in different ways depending on who the breadwinner is. And by all means, if there is a household kept afloat on the wife's income, there's no issue with her being career-driven and bringing home, the proverbial bacon. There's always very much been this idea that women should be the homemakers and men should be the breadwinners, but it doesn't have to look like that. At the end of the day, though, the ideal is for someone to be present for the kids, if there are children. The whole point is that beyond the injustice of female oppression and misogyny, there are also other people who matter besides just the woman. Her rights are important and necessary, but I think we need to remember that there should have always been a shared sense of responsibility between partners to manage the home and the children. So what does this all boil down to? I think what we're getting at here is the question of selfishness. Women always should have been extended the same basic personal freedoms and consideration and respect as their male counterparts, but because of the transgressions committed against women for hundreds of years, the response to those transgressions was so extreme that there's now a vicious cycle where in many cases, no one wants to or feels they should have to sacrifice. And so the family as a whole suffers, namely the children. And we see this in the case of The Awakening. Edna Pontellier undoubtedly has a really lonely life with a husband who treats her pretty unkindly and coldly much of the time. It is natural for her to want more. It is natural for her eyes to be opened at some point, if she's not merely sleepwalking through life, where she begins to be more honest with herself about what she wants and what she has been denied by society, her husband, and even herself. On page 16, Chopin writes, "At a very early period, she had apprehended instinctively the dual life, that outward existence which conforms, the inward life which questions." So Edna's awakening involves a return to the self in the form of authenticity and radical honesty. She begins to entertain feelings for and relationships with other men. She devotes more time to her passion for art, and she moves out of her house, all without much regard at all for anyone other than herself. And it's tough because as a reader, I sympathized with her, as I imagine was Chopin's goal. But on the other hand, I also spotted many areas where she acted quite selfishly and frankly immaturely. And maybe that's also a bit of the point. Edna was written to be fully human, with a beating pulse and strong, youthful limbs that are referenced multiple times throughout the novella, with passion and desires and an identity and a will of her own. And all of that is human. It is so deeply, wonderfully human. We were never meant to be separated from these aspects of existence. Male or female, our lives should be an amalgamation of identity, personality, and uniquely personal gifts with sacrifice, generosity, and charity. We cannot ignore or exclude one subset for the other, otherwise we get imbalance. We get extremes, and as we know from history, extremes rarely work long term. One of the supporting characters in The Awakening, Madame Ratignolle, acts as a foil to Edna's character, embodying the ultimate housewife and mother who has dedicated her entire life to her family and the care of the home. She doesn't question things, she's not particularly interested in self-discovery, and we get the sense that she is overall pretty content with her life and with the status quo. And when she pays her friend a visit after she has moved out of her house, she chides Edna for her choices, saying, "In some ways you seem to me like a child, Edna. You seem to act without a certain amount of reflection, which is necessary in this life." Upon reading this, I was actually so glad that someone finally spoke the truth to Edna, telling her what she probably needed to hear. And I'll admit, I'm probably in the minority of readers with this perspective. I think the vast majority read this book and are Edna's biggest fans from start to finish. But my feelings about her life and her choices were far too complex to label cleanly. For one thing, even though Edna's husband could be absolutely insufferable, I thought it was ridiculous that she decided to simply move out of their home while he was away on business without even really having discussed it with him. She basically just wrote him a letter and then began boxing up her things. And meanwhile, she tells her friends that she'll fund her dinner parties and social events on her husband's dime, which honestly just seems extremely petty. And her 2 young sons are constantly separated from her throughout the book, raised by the family nanny and later by their grandmother, when there's literally no need for them to live elsewhere or spend so much time with people who are not their parents, aside from the fact that Edna has suddenly become this enlightened woman who only cares about pursuing her own pleasure. Her boys cling to her when they see her, and she spends maybe 5 seconds with them before casting them off to devote her attention to some trivial thing or illicit feeling. In fact, on page 57 in my Penguin Classics edition, Edna had once told Madame Ratignolle that she would never sacrifice herself for her children or for anyone. "I would give up the unessential, I would give my money, I would give my life for my children, but I wouldn't give myself." And again, I had some conflicting feelings about this. On one hand, I can see and sort of agree with what she's saying in certain cases, but I do think by and large, a person's children and their health and happiness and comfort should be their priority, because children are helpless and powerless and rely on their parents to protect them and love them well. I strongly feel that we are all owed that right as children, and it is a right that we then extend to our own children someday if we have them. And this is where a balance must be achieved between the duty to the self and the duty to our loved ones. Because ultimately, with great love comes great responsibility. And it is love and responsibility that give life meaning beyond, endless navel gazing. On page 135 in my edition, Edna goes so far as to say, "I don't want anything but my own way." That is wanting a good deal, of course, when you have to trample upon the lives, the hearts, the prejudices of others. But no matter. Still, I shouldn't want to trample upon the little lives. What I eventually concluded after reading these types of admissions while following along on Edna's journey of self-discovery was that there is something poisonous about this unchecked duty to the self. Again, life is about balance, and when you prioritize yourself above all else, it, I believe, becomes all-consuming and also quite depressing. And if you listened to my recent episode on The Underground Man by Dostoevsky, we touch on this a lot here as well. Part of the joy of life is experiencing the fruits of your generosity. We inevitably go through really hard trials as parents, as partners, as loved ones, but assuming the situation is not dangerous or abusive, there are rewards to be experienced after those trials. There is something diverting and wholesome and good, honestly, in forgetting yourself for a little while. Not permanently, not at the expense of yourself, but giving your love and attention to other people gets you out of your own head and helps you experience life more fully and more healthfully. When you become hell-bent on getting your own way at all costs, you are never going to be fully happy. And I believe this is a mentality that often leads to depression. I myself am prone to this, and I have found that focusing less on myself and more on other people actually has a healing effect and feels better than dwelling endlessly on my own thoughts, feelings, concerns, and anxieties. And now I want to take this opportunity to say, as a note of forewarning, if you are not interested in spoilers and want to read this book, which I highly, highly recommend, I suggest pausing this episode for now and returning to it once you have finished reading. Because now we're going to get into what unfolds in the final pages of the book, and it's quite a dark, dramatic ending, though some may interpret it as Edna finally finding the unbridled freedom she has yearned for. So Edna seeks out a relationship with Robert Lebrun, having fallen in love with him despite her marriage and even despite another affair with yet another suitor. But it turns out that Lebrun has more of a conscience than Edna, and after one brief stolen moment of affection, he leaves her a note saying, "I love you. Goodbye because I love you." And I almost immediately knew what this note meant for Edna. Upon reading it, her entire world shifts. There is no longer any meaning, any purpose beyond this man she's pined after for what seems to be a long time. And after a long sleepless night, she goes down to the beach and swims out as far as she can. And though it is not spelled out in the book, she drowns. And of course, it is understood that this is deliberate. Edna is quite distraught as she makes her way to the beach, deciding that there was no human being that she wanted near her but Robert, but also giving some small consideration to her sons as well, mourning what her choice would mean for them. On page 138, Chopin writes, "The children appeared before her like antagonists who had overcome her, who had overpowered and sought to drag her into the soul slavery for the rest of her days. But she knew a way to elude them." And then again on page 139, "She thought of Léonce and the children. They were a part of her life, but they need not have thought that they could possess her, body and soul." I feel that these passages end up proving my point about how an unchecked obsession with the self and the self's interests, especially at the expense of loved ones, leads to death and destruction, quite literally in the awakening, but also a type of death in the soul. It accomplishes the opposite of what is sought, resulting in increased neurosis, agitation, and restlessness. Of course, these are the very conditions that lead to depressive states. And to be perfectly clear, I am not saying here that we have a duty to perpetually neglect ourselves or ignore what is good for us or important for us to please everyone else. But as a woman, I can personally say that just because women have been oppressed and discriminated against for hundreds of years doesn't entitle me to a lifetime of selfishness or narcissism. I am entitled to the same rights, pleasures, responsibilities, and freedoms as everyone else. And I probably come at this from a very privileged place because at the time of writing, Kate Chopin would not have had those same rights, pleasures, responsibilities, and freedoms, nor would her female characters. So I'm not in a position to adequately judge Edna Pontellier because I married for love, not out of obligation, and I have a husband who supports my self-care in every way so that I can be the mom I need to be to our daughter. And I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for the thousands and thousands of women whom Edna represents who didn't have that same partnership or respect from their spouse. So at the end of the day, I don't think Edna is someone we're meant to fully admire or fully condemn. She instead reflects a tension that lives in all of us. This desire to be known, to be free, to live honestly. At the same time, the reality is that our lives are not lived in isolation. We belong to other people, just as they belong to us. Edna's downfall isn't that she chose herself, it's that she never found a way to hold both. To be a self and to be in relation to others without seeing those two things as enemies. Because I don't think the answer is total sacrifice, and I don't think it's total self-devotion either. I think it's something far more complex than either of those extremes. It's learning how to live a life that is both deeply personal and deeply responsible. A life where the duty to others isn't all-encompassing, and also a life where you respect and honor a healthy duty to the self. Thank you so much for being here with me today. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to follow the podcast and share it with someone who might find meaning in it too. And as always, I'll meet you back here soon by the fire.